Good morning. It's Friday morning, so it's time for my weekly lesson about imperialism with Joti Brar, and you get to hang around too. Let's talk. Hello, Garland here with Joti Brar, and we get to learn a lot today together. A very interesting subject that is particularly applicable in the United States right now, and that in the West period, and that is this concept of imperialism, of pockets of imperialism, right? That you can support the Nazi imperialists in Ukraine, you can accept the arguments of the US empire that they have to oppose the evil Russia and they're doing the right thing in Ukraine. At the same time, you can concede, which is probably an appropriate term, that US imperialism is up to no good by committing a genocide in Gaza. So we're going to start with this. Joti's going to help us out. This is I found this interesting. So there's this organization called Stand Against Genocide and Imperialism from Palestine to Ukraine, statement of the Ukraine Solidarity Network on the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Perfect example here. And what this group is, they're arguing that you've got to stand against imperialism, which would be the United States, in Gaza and occupied Palestine. However, the imperialists somehow change into the good guys and somebody else is the imperialist. Like they're the imperialist over here, but they're not imperialist over there. I smell a rat or perhaps an agent. Your thoughts, Joti Brar?
Well, I think you're right that whoever penned this statement is an agent. It has a bunch of very classic Trotskyite formulations, and Trotskyism, and there's lots of material on this on my party's website and on our YouTube channel. So go along to Proletarian TV and look up Trotskyism. But Trotskyism essentially is a weapon of the imperialists in the working class movement. So when you look at that statement that you highlighted, Garland, and I'm sure you'll stick it into the comments below so people can read it at their leisure later. But the fundamental premise in that statement is actually the lie that the war in Ukraine is an inter-imperialist war. So they don't quite say the US are the good guys, but they say there are two bad guys. And the bad guys are US imperialism on one side and Russian imperialism on the other side. And the poor old Ukrainian people are stuck in the middle between these two horrible warring imperialist sides. And that the cause of the war in Ukraine was invasion by Russia, unprovoked, right? Just the act of an aggressive imperialist power that just decided, oh, there's a country nearby that I want to take over. I'm going on the rampage, right? This is imperialist propaganda. This is NATO's propaganda. This is what the EU says about what the war is all about. This is what NATO says, is what the USA says. This is the imperialist pretext for its war against Russia and Ukraine. But the truth, of course, we know is that the war, really, it's been going on for decades, the West's war against Russia, when it was the Soviet Union, and since then. But this latest phase of the war began in 2014. It began with the fascist coup, backed by the USA in particular, but by the EU as well. It was known as the Euromaidan, if you remember. In 2014, the government of Ukraine, which was not totally sovereign, but what was left of Ukraine's sovereignty was lost when that government was kicked out by a CIA-backed coup and fascists were installed under the direct control of the CIA and MI6. And ever since then, Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian country, the Ukrainian forces have been used as a battering ram as a playground for the CIA, as a battering ram against Russia. But the statement that we've seen, that you highlighted by this Ukrainian Solidarity Organization, is an attempt to manipulate the widespread understanding that we should have solidarity with Palestine and that popular support into support for fascist Ukraine by making comparisons which have no basis in fact, and relying on the fact that most of the people, many of the people reading it in the West, don't understand the truth about Russia and Ukraine because they've been subjected to huge amounts of propaganda, and they haven't really taken the time or had the opportunity to find out anything different, because, you know, the alternative viewpoints are hard to come by. You have to work quite hard to get to them. So most people in the West have been tainted to some extent by Russophobia. And even if they are cynical about the wars, they will kind of accept some of the premises of NATO's propaganda. So in that statement, they completely wiped out the truth about what the government in Kiev is, right, which is a fascist junta, who it serves, i.e. the USA and NATO, what ideology it uses to mobilize its people in the West's fight to destroy Russia, which is essentially the Nazi ideology. Well, not essentially, it's actually Nazi ideology, right? They have a Russophobic supremacism. They tried to create a two-tier ethno-state, just like the state the Israelis have created in Palestine, right? So the people who wrote this statement have turned reality on its head, because there is a comparison between the war in Ukraine and the war in Palestine, but they've got it back to front over in which direction the genocide was going. You know, the statement compares the Russian war in Ukraine to like Russia's war in Ukraine to the West's war in Palestine. But the problem is that they've turned it upside down. The Russian war in Ukraine is an anti-fascist war of self-defense and national liberation. But the US-backed Zionist assault on Palestine is a fascistic war of aggression to impose imperialist domination on Palestine and on the whole of the Middle East. So they turned everything inside out and back to front. They tried to back it up by declaring that Russia targets civilians, targets schools, targets hospitals, that Russia has genocidal intent. There is zero evidence of that because it's not true. The truth is the opposite. It is the Ukrainian junta, backed and armed and trained by the West, which has been targeting civilians in Donbass for a decade, which has bombed schools and hospitals and clinics, which has had a supremacist ideology that others the Russian people, the Russian ethnic population of former Ukrainian state, which was about a third or even up to a half of the population, had created a two-tier system for them and had a clear genocidal intent towards them, had motivated a huge fascistic bully boy section of the population with very explicitly genocidal intent towards everything Russian, right? So totally upside down narration, all based. So pretending to come from a progressive point of view, classic Trotskyist tactic, pretending to come from a progressive point of view, but actually repeating every single NATO and imperialist talking point about Russia. So they've made this declaration that Russia wants to erase the Ukraine as a people, erase its national identity. Exactly the opposite of what was really happening, which was that the Ukrainian elite, the Ukrainian regime, and specifically the fascistic section of that, its explicit program was to erase the Russian identity, the Russian language from Ukrainian soil. So we have typical Trotskyist formulations in this document that their enemies, the typical Trotskyist formulation that the Ukrainian people's enemies are both their own government and the Russian imperialists. And that in accepting weapons from the West, this is just a kind of question of realpolitik for them, nothing to do with the fact that they're actually been turned into foot soldiers for a Western imperialist attempt to destroy and recolonize Russia. And there's another very typical Trotskyist formulation in there, which is meant to confuse people, where they call for worker-to-worker solidarity with the workers of Palestine and the workers of Ukraine. And while they're doing it, they take the chance to vilify not only the USA and not only the Russians, but also Hamas. They call Hamas, they do this classic thing where they say, well, of course, Hamas is Islamist and therefore reactionary. So that's another classical Trotskyist kind of metaphysical formulation that if you're motivated by religion in any way, you must necessarily be reactionary. So you take away all of the context of why they're using religion and the content, how they are struggling and what they're struggling against. And you just say, oh, well, if they talk in the words of religion, they must be reactionary, mustn't they? And again, that might wash with a Western audience who hasn't lived the reality of the oppressed world, but it doesn't wash if you actually understand anything about why it is Middle Eastern, so much of Middle Eastern resistance, not all of it, but so much of it has ended up being in the language of the mosque. How many readers in the West, ordinary people, understand that back in the day, the huge majority of the anti-imperialist socialist movement, national liberation movement in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Middle East, was socialist, was secular. What happened to the socialist secular movement? It was wiped out on the orders physically in many cases. In some cases, people went into exile, but huge numbers of communists in particular were physically exterminated, basically on the orders of the West, because they thought that was the way to defeat the national liberation movement. But of course, the people remain. And when the masses remain and their situation of being oppressed by finance capital, by imperialism hasn't changed, the need to resist is still there. So what happens when you've decapitated the leadership of the movement and you've banned all types of gatherings under any kind of aegis of a political organization? It ends up in the one place where people are still allowed to gather, the mosque, right? So now the need for resistance remains. The mosque is the place people gather. So guess what? Now the language in which people express their resistance is the language of the Quran and the language of the mosque. But the content of the struggle is anti-imperialism. And this is something Trotskyism will never look at and never explain to you. They'll just say, oh, Hamas, they're reactionary, because they're Islamists, and therefore, that's like the same as fascism, isn't it? So the truth is that there are mosques and there are mosques, just like there are churches and there are churches. We've all heard of liberation theology in Latin America. It emerged for pretty much the same reasons, right? Communists were being hounded, executed all over the place, but people were still allowed to go to church. So guess what? Some of the churches became kind of bastions of the people's struggle and supporters of the poor in their struggle against imperialism. And it's the same with the mosques. Some of them are bastions of reactionary state power. Some of them are tools of imperialism, pushing Wahhabi ideology onto the people. Others are supporting the poor in their struggle against imperialist oppression and looting, and helping provide justifications for the struggle of the masses, giving them support in that struggle. So again, it's a very Trotskyite, metaphysical, and really playing to the prejudices of a Western audience, kind of in many ways, this statement. They use the word imperialism without explaining the content of what imperialism is as a global economic system. They just use it as a swear word, right? It just means a big country, the way they use it. And big is synonymous with bad, must be evil. They're big, they must be evil. They've got a big army, they must be evil. They must be imperialist, they must have bad intent. It plays to our prejudices because we live in countries that are ruled by imperialists, and they have armies and use their power that way. So to us, it makes sense. If you're a big power, you must be an imperialist. And if you have a big army, the only reason for having that army is because you want to be aggressive. That makes sense to us. So the propaganda kind of lands quite easily, but it doesn't actually reflect reality. And it's interesting, just on a little side note, before I finish and hand back to you, Garland, I noticed in the statement, again, very Trotskyite thing to do, they listed a few other national liberation struggles they support. And what was noticeable to me was out of the 4 they listed, 2 of them are ones that are very much patronized by the West in terms of being useful tools for achieving bases in strategic areas. One of them they mentioned was the Kurdish national struggle. And we've seen how the Kurdish struggle has been manipulated in the Middle East to turn the Kurds into a proxy army for US imperialism against the wider Arab world.
Particularly
and the
Syria.
wider, yes, very much in
And-
Syria, but in Iran, Iraq,
Yep.
across the region, right? And Kashmir is the other one. You know, now I don't deny at all that the Kashmiri people have suffered terribly in recent decades, but the US and imperialist interest in Kashmir is not about the sufferings of the Kashmiri people. It's about the fact that they would love an independent Kashmir would be tiny and be totally reliant for its independence from India and Pakistan on the USA, which means it would basically turn into a US base in a highly strategic area up there between India and China and Russia. So again, you see the hand of the imperialists at work in this seemingly innocuous call for solidarity with national liberation struggles, just by the ones that they pick in their list, And the truth is that the people who are waging a struggle for self-determination in Russia, as I said, in Ukraine, are the people of the Donbass. They've been fighting for a decade against the US-imposed fascist coup regime in Kiev. And Russia came to their aid when it finally, and many people would say very belatedly, reached the conclusion that there was simply no way to negotiate with or placate the West, and that everything that was happening in Ukraine was ultimately targeted at them.
What's interesting is I started searching on a couple of the people's names in there, and I found some very suspicious characters. One of them is a Iranian feminist who just happens to support all the Western regime change operations. Oh, poor women have to wear hijab and blah, blah. All of the stuff that they use here. Another one is a person who supports Syrian independence from the brutal Assad regime, right? Another one is a guy named John Pfeffer, a guy who I once debated about Ukraine. And when he came, what's interesting is when he came to the event, I think the Nation magazine or something put it on. He was noted as a representative of, I'm not going to say it, but a representative of a U.S. congressman who is a neocon. So he came there representing the office of a U.S. congressman. And in fact, when I asked, this was about Russiagate, the Russians interfered in the election. And when I asked him, why do you believe it? What is the foundation for you believing that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election? A question, of course, he probably never heard in his circles. And he did one of these. Well, in other words, I got to come up with something right now because crap, I never thought about that. We got to believe that because that's who we are. It's what we do. He was like, well, there was an article. He literally said this about a Danish group of intelligence officers who hacked into a Russian camera, and they saw the Russians hacking on, doing their hacking material. And I'm like, yeah, I'm familiar with that article. In fact, they said they hacked into a camera in a hallway in Moscow University, and all they could see was people coming in and out of the door, and they suspected that they were involved in hacking, right? Then he goes to another article. There was a guy in Russia who was charged with some crime, and the guy admitted that he was paid by the government to be involved in the Russiagate hacking whatever scheme for the U.S., right? But he didn't know where the trial was. He didn't know what the guy was charged with. He didn't know the guy's name. He didn't know the outcome of the trial. So what convinced him was that Russiagate was valid was a trial, but he knew nothing about the trial. In other words, same kind of thing. I'm taking this position. Please do not ask me. I don't even have a superficial understanding of it because I don't need it. These are the kind of people, and I look at it and I'm like, I'm not like a conspiracy theorist that the CIA, the term invented by the CIA, but I'm a skeptical person. But when I start seeing people show up in a group and they have a history of taking the side and actually pushing US intelligence, US imperialist interest, a history of doing that. And now they all come together. Kind of seems to me they're doing the same thing. Your thoughts? Am I overly skeptical and suspicious to think that this is not just a bunch of Trotskyists, that they may very well be connected to nefarious entities in the empire?
My view is that those two things are the same thing. Fundamentally, I mean, you know, there are ordinary working class people tend not to be very working class, tend to be kind of on the student intelligentsia end of the working class. But there are ordinary, well-intentioned people who get caught up in the Trotskyite machinery. That's what it's there for. It's there to catch people with a leaning towards a revolutionary sentiment, people who are seeing that things are wrong in the world and wanting to change it, to present themselves as organizations which are aimed at changing the world in a progressive way, to catch particularly young people, particularly students, and keep them busy until they become cynical and fall off, having believed that they have tried being a socialist and it didn't get them anywhere, right? So there is a machinery created by Trotskyites to do that. But fundamentally, the leaderships of these organizations and the funding, when you get to the roots of it, is backed by the state. And there's a good reason for that. You know, it's very important for our rulers to do a lot of misdirection. You know, we've talked about this before. The longer imperialism exists for, the fewer the absolute number of people in whose interests it really is that the system should continue, right? The ruling class itself is shrinking. The numbers of the poor are growing day by day by day. So, you know, we're now, you know, 125 years into fully established imperialism in the world, right? The numbers of people in whose real interest it is that this state of affairs should continue is vanishingly small. They pay. We talked about it last week, how there's the social democratic kind of peace deal is that the imperialist ruling class bribes a section of the working class with better standard of living, with privileges, and bribes off the leadership, creates an NGO class and a Mandarin class and a class of its officers to control the masses with. But still, there's a huge number of people in the masses in whose interest this system is not, and who are becoming steadily more impoverished and more angry. And you know, there's many weapons that the ruling class uses to try to divide the people against one another and to misdirect them. And one of the things they've been very keen to do, you know, probably since the October Revolution, but very much since World War II, is to capture the students. Because if you look at every successful revolution, you will see that revolutionary students played a very important role. Young people, very often, as well as having energy, they will have a kind of revolutionary vigor about them. You know, they have a sense of, you know, wanting to fight for the future, and less kind of worry about, you know, what they're going to lose in terms of their, you know, privileges and all the rest of it. They're more likely to put it all on the line for a noble cause. And that's a wonderful characteristic of young people, right? And so if you can harness that fervor, and that energy to a good cause, you can really, you know, give a boost of energy and enthusiasm, as long as you also have, you know, a trained and older leadership that has, you know, that has experience and knowledge to share with these people who have lots and lots of enthusiasm and vigor. The other thing about students, of course, is they have time on their hands. They have the ability to read and educate themselves, which a lot of ordinary workers don't have. So they can bring all of that, you know, their energy, their abilities, their enthusiasm into the movement, and it can be a very important part of a successful revolution. So in the West, the imperialists have worked very hard to misdirect the revolutionary sympathies of the section of the student community which is naturally that way inclined. And Trotskyism has been their very, very useful tool in that enterprise, because it dresses up. So on the one hand, it repeats imperialist propaganda. And the thing is, a lot of imperialist propaganda lands easily with us because we've been hearing it all our lives. What it does is it then dresses up that imperialist propaganda with ultra-revolutionary phrases, which tick the box for these kind of young revolutionary feeling people of like, oh yeah, I just want a revolution. I just want to rip it all up and tear it down and start again and go, yeah. But it uses what's pseudoscience. It dresses itself up in the clothes and the language of the Bolsheviks. You know, they'll tend to have names of newspapers and names of newspapers and a language that makes them sound like they're the inheritors of Lenin and the October Revolution, which is very attractive and appealing, right? But if you look at the essence of what they say, it almost always supports an imperialist propaganda narrative. So it's a kind of clever trick, a very nasty trick to play on these young people, but very effective in the West, you know, because people's knowledge in the West of what imperialism really is very, very slim because they haven't lived outside the bubble of imperialist cushioning and of imperialist kind of media to really understand how the imperialist system works. And so when the Trotskyists will say to you, for example, we can't support the leadership of the Palestinian resistance because they are bourgeois or they're Islamo-fascist, that sounds very revolutionary. It sounds revolutionary. You have to read Lenin yourself and not have Lenin explained to you by a Trotskyist in order to realize how wrong that way of explaining the world is and who it serves. That serves the imperialists. We will denounce the leadership of every national liberation struggle because it doesn't come up to our ideal of what a proletarian leadership looks like. And it turns out nobody's leadership is okay with the Trotskyites. They've got a revolutionary way of dismissing them all, right? This struggle is not done right. This struggle is not done the right way. This struggle is not done the right way. You know, this building of socialism is not being done the right way. Nobody's doing anything right. It's amazing. We are pure. It's not for nothing that no Trotskyite ever led anything successful, right? There's never been a Trotskyite-led revolution. There's never been a Trotskyite-led building of socialism. But it's not possible, right? Actually, Trotskyism is not what it's presented as the kind of inheritor of Leninism and the way to get to our socialist future. It is a tool for making sure that a section of revolutionary-minded people in the West are kept away from giving their energies to the struggle for socialism.
You know, I think one of the things they're doing here in saying, hey, you can oppose the Gaza thing. Meanwhile, you can support support the Ukrainian, you know, imperialist aggression against Russia. I think one of the things they're doing is look, I'll recognize I'm going to take a loss here and I'll provide you a comfortable place, right? So I recognize you group right here, you're not down with the Gaza situation, with what we're doing there, and you're not going to. It's not going to happen. I see that I've lost a big block here, but I don't want to lose them everywhere. So let me give you a nice, comfortable place to be. I'm going to, knowing there's no way to fix that, you're going to oppose Gaza. What I want to do is at least recover as much of this as I can. So I say, okay, yeah, I'm down with you. We got to oppose Gaza. You know, I send my agents in. They say, we got to oppose Gaza. We're with you. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. However, now that we're discussing this thing, let's not forget, let's not lose the importance of supporting these poor, brave freedom fighters against the evil Russians in Ukraine. So it's like recognizing imperialism, recognizes the states, recognizes I'm going to take a loss here. I try to utilize that to still get my win over here. That I try, you know, one of the things that's interesting, let me read this. And they're saying that, let me find it. They admit that here's something that's in capital letters, so I think it needs to be, I need your questions on it, right? So there's like the staggering cynicism of the Biden administration denouncing Russian missiles that destroy schools and hospitals in Ukraine while sending weapons to perform such atrocities in Gaza. may lead some activists to conclude that U.S. backing for Ukraine delegitimizes its, listen to this word, people's struggle against Russia. It is a people's struggle against Russia, right? And they go on to say, yet a closer look shows that, and this is what highlighted, and it's critical. I want to get your thoughts on it. Yet a closer look shows that, highlighted, both Ukraine and Palestine are facing wars waged on them by powers that seek not only to subjugate them militarily, but to erase them as a people with their own national identity. It's interesting that they make a highlight of this is, it's almost like they're saying, this is where we're going to define Ukraine as a people's struggle, leaving out that, well, the Ukrainians outlawed the Russian language. What kind of people struggle outlaws the Russian language, outlawed the Russian religion? You know, but now it's defined as a people struggle. I think it's interesting that they highlighted that part of it.
Totally. And, you know, as you said, Garland, they're totally relying on using emotional manipulation on people who don't know anything about the history or the context. Because if you did know, you read that straight away and you know it's just lies and it's absurd. But presumably their intended audience is people who don't know and will take what they say as fact because they've read it in the papers, right? This is what the Trotskyites do. They dress up things that the imperialists are saying with progressive sounding words around them. And when they repeat the lies with progressive phrases, the lies don't get noticed by people because they've been reading those things already. They thought they already knew that. I've read in the papers about the terrible things that Russians have done to Ukraine, right? This description of the Ukrainian people's struggle is really significant. That's also a classic Trotskyite formulation. My whole political life, I've been going to anti-war movement meetings where I would hear Trotskyists get up and declaim, for example, when the war was being prepared against Syria, we were told by Trotskyists that there was a popular uprising in Syria against the government of Bashar al-Assad. We were told there was a popular uprising and that there were workers' councils being organized on the ground. So it was like a Soviet revolution was happening in the grassroots. And what's the conclusion of that? That it's right for NATO to arm those people against their government, right? That NATO is on the right side when it tries to remove the government. It's on the popular side. They said exactly the same about Libya. They said exactly, there are people's councils being formed. They said it about Iran. When they were trying to make a green revolution, remember that? There are people's councils being formed on the ground. Do you know what I have never heard any Trotskyite organization do? Admit that there were no people's councils, that they got confused, they were misled somehow. They never, ever, ever retract what they said about a war they're trying to justify for imperialism. They stand in these meetings at the moment when imperialism is unleashing the full fury of its propaganda onslaught against a country to justify bombing it into oblivion. The Trotskyites will come along and say, oh, there's a people's uprising happening against this awful dictatorial government, and we must support the people's councils that are forming on the ground. And they'll make it sound like there's a big popular revolution happening by the workers against their evil government. An evil government that we all know is evil. How do we all know it's evil? Because the papers keep telling us how evil it is, right? So I think when you look at this statement and the way they've tried to hitch this type of analysis onto a Palestine and make these really terrible analogies, what you're seeing is a classic case of bandwagon jumping, right? The fact is, they can't do their standard anti-PLO line that they've been doing for years because they have no credibility. They have to show some support for the Palestinians in Gaza, right? But if you look at the way they do it, it's pretty poisonous. You know, I said already that they branded Hamas as kind of an enemy of the Palestinian people, essentially, Islamofascists. One thing that's not in that statement, but I'm sure you'll find it elsewhere in things they've written, is their call for Israeli workers and Palestinian workers to unite together against all their evil governments, right? This is a classic Trotskyite formulation because it discounts the entire reality of what's actually happening, and discounts the reality that there's a national liberation struggle going on, and that the Israeli population has been turned into a stooge army for imperialism, and they're not going to see the light until they're defeated as an army. You can't mobilize them in their masses right now on the side of the Palestinian working class. And equally, to describe the every Palestinian national bourgeois as reactionary because of because they might be owners of business, is to completely misunderstand imperialism. But of course, that's what Trotskyism does. Trotskyism doesn't recognize Lenin's thesis on imperialism, doesn't recognize that in the oppressed world, the national bourgeois are a revolutionary force against imperialism. So they just only recognize workers as revolutionary and everybody else is reactionary, right? Every peasant is reactionary, every petty bourgeois, every national bourgeois, even an oppressed country, really oppressed country who's fighting for liberation from imperialism, they're all reactionaries. Only proletarians are revolutionary. That's the Trotskyite formulation. And of course, it's the road to defeat and ruin. It's a demand that you fight all your enemies simultaneously, and therefore you will lose, right? Which is not what Leninist tactics do. That's not what successful revolutions have ever done. But what you see, in the way they formulate these things, what they're actually saying, even when they're giving their support to Palestine, they do it in such a way where, but you can't support the Palestinian people's own chosen leadership. Hang on a minute. So they've phrased it as if that leadership has been foisted on the Palestinians. Not that it's come from the Palestinian masses, that they've chosen it, that they've created it, and that it is there at this moment. It's their chosen leadership, right? So, but the Trotskyists always reserve the right not to accept the leadership chosen by any people. Say, well, no, we just need to go lower and deeper and make worker-to-worker connections. But they're talking just in abstract pie-in-the-sky way. It sounds nice, but in reality, who is it you're talking about working with? Who is it you're going to be supporting? And the fact is, it's a formula for doing nothing whilst keeping yourself on the side and being very, very pure.
Here's something interesting. The end of this document, again, it's this Ukraine solidarity movement, right? They, as many Jewish participants in the Palestine solidarity movement have pointed out, the genocide against Jews in the Second World War is being used to both justify genocide against Palestinians today and attempt to erase Ukraine. Never again for the Jews, never again for the Palestinians, never again for the Ukrainians, never again for anyone. First of all, I don't know anybody, never again for the Jews. I didn't know anybody that's trying to erase the Jews, right? Never again for the Jews. How does that even get in here? Number one. Number two, the very people who tried to take the Jews out in the first place are goose-stepping around Ukraine, and we're arming them. So you're like, we've got to stand up against genocide against the Jews by supporting the goose-stepping, swastika-covered people who genocided them in the first place. And what does that have to do with it? If anything, it proves that we're wrong. And then they go on to say, and this is being used to justify Ukraine, which to me implies that it says it's being used to justify the Russia's attempt to erase Ukraine, right? Imperialist language, which kind of implies that it is wrong to point out that there's Nazis in Ukraine. If you point out that there's Nazis in Ukraine, then you're going along with Putin to justify him fighting Nazis in Ukraine, which we shouldn't do. We shouldn't do that. We got to support those Nazis. Joti.
Totally. I mean, the thing is, Garland, you're using your knowledge of what's going on to expose how ludicrous this statement is. But the statement is drafted and aimed at people who don't have that knowledge and are therefore not able to see the way that reality is being turned upside down. It's the job of people like us to try to propagate this information. But, it's difficult to get it to the people who are sitting inside a certain bubble. These people have their uses. and especially in the trade union movement. We have a similar organization in Britain. It has no mass membership or anything. It's called the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, I think. So again, it dresses up like it's, just a standard, another progressive organization, right? There's the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, there's the Colombia Solidarity Campaign, and now we've also got the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. Good. So it must be a progressive organization, mustn't it? And this organization doesn't have like a mass membership, it's not engaged in mass activities, but it has some key, very reactionary trade union leaders attached to it. And between them, so they use all the same kind of talking points that we've seen in this statement. And on their website, they print lots of they print lots of statements, supposedly from left-wing commentators, activists, politicians, and trade unionists in Ukraine. Now, this all looks and sounds very lovely. And of course, they're all appealing for the help of the trade unionists in Britain against the evil Putin invasion, right? And this works for people who have only read imperialist media. It sounds progressive. It's all dressed up the right way, except what is never mentioned, of course, and what they're relying on most people not knowing is that trade unionists, opposition politicians have been silenced, suppressed, imprisoned, shut down. So who are these people they found in Ukraine who are still openly operating as trade unionists, openly operating as opposition politicians? They can't be anything other than CIA plants, because all the real ones are either in prison or in hiding.
Well, if you look at their document, one of the things this Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, here's what's interesting, that one of their aims is to support and build direct links with the independent socialists and the labor movement in Ukraine. Number one, independent socialists, not socialist organizations. And number two, it's illegal to be a socialist in Ukraine. They've outlawed socialism. So your job is to get and again, independent. They don't say socialist organizations. They can't, because they're outlawed. They'd be killed. So we got to find some independent ones. But if you did that, they'd be outed to the government and they'd be killed or imprisoned or some combination of the two.
No, they find people that they put up and they get to speak on behalf of the socialists and trade unionists of Ukraine. But as I say, if they're still operating openly and allowed to broadcast themselves as that, that's because they are Azov approved, CIA approved cutouts, right? And these people are sponsoring, or they're not sponsoring. It's the CIA who's sponsoring it, let's face it. But they are fronting for this campaign by the CIA to give a progressive look to the Nazi war against Russia, right? We had a horrible, shameful resolution passed by our trade union Congress at its last meeting. I'm sorry, I can't remember when it was. Maybe it was last November in Britain, that was sponsored by exactly these type of people, and it had the backing of like the GMB union, some various unions involved in the arms trade, arms manufacture, weapon members who are making weapons, saying that, repeating these types of talking points and using quotations and facts drawn from the press releases and the statements made by these CIA cutout figures in Ukraine who claim to be part of a real workers' movement in Ukraine. And of course, this only works because so many of the people they're talking to don't have a clue about the real situation for real trade unionists in Ukraine. And let us not forget that this week, yesterday was the 10th anniversary of the massacre by the forces of the Kiev junta of people in Odessa who were fighting against the coup regime and who took refuge in the trade union house of Odessa. And it was burned to the ground. And the people who took refuge there were either burned inside it or killed as they tried to escape from it. a horrific massacre that none of our trade union movements in Britain or the USA ever talk about.
You know, something interesting. So, one of the things that I think is of great consequence, you just mentioned this Ukraine solidarity movement camp. You know, we're talking about this Ukraine solidarity movement thing in the US, which are like, oh, we're going to support Ukraine, but not Gaza, right? And I'm like, yeah, that stinks of imperialists and CIA. So then you tell me, well, you know, Garland, we've got something similar in Britain. So, you know, we've got it here too. And I'm thinking, gee, I wonder if that's a coincidence, right? So while you were talking, I go to their website and I find that they're connected to where is it? They're connected to the International Marxist-Humanist Organization, right? And if we look right in the middle of the page, what do we find? Stand against genocide and imperialism from Palestine to Ukraine. If we go right to the center of the page for this International Marxist Humanist organization, we find the very document that we are discussing from the United States. This is CIA. I mean, right off the bat, I'm like, this stinks of CIA all over it. Wow, they've got the same thing. The International, Ukrainian Solidarity Movement, the Solidarity Campaign. As soon as I saw Marxist, Marxist or whatever, what's it called? It is called the, let's put it up again so people can see it. It is called this is important, the International Marxist-Humanist Campaign. As soon as I saw that, I thought, human rights. And I look and it's like standing up for feminism in Gaza, in Gambia or something like that. And I look, I'm like, well, that just sounds very neoliberal. And look at there, right in the middle of the page, there it is. Stand against genocide and imperialism from Palestine to Ukraine, Ukraine Solidarity Network. So now it goes from a movement one place, Ukraine Solidarity Movement in one country, Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in another and now it's the Ukraine Solidarity Network, and they're sharing each other. So bottom line is this is a NATO, US empire, imperialist operation and organization that we are pretty much exposing right now.
Totally. And, you know, it's the classic NED formula, isn't it? Because the National Endowment for Democracy, in every country it goes to, it will create an NGO that's for democracy, and it will just give it a name, but it's essentially just their local branch of the NED, right? And it will then that will have a bunch of organizations that come out of it and get funding from it and have a whole load of different names promoting democracy, grassroots revival, blah, 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 blah. And it's all the same strategy, the same rubbish that they're pushing, they're trying to persuade the people to follow a line that they are implanting in their interests, right? In the name of all kinds of buzzwords that sound really good to people who have had generations of being oppressed by imperialism and on the orders of imperialism, right? So lots of people like the sound of words like human rights and democracy. They say, yes, please, we'd like some of that. What they don't realize is the people who are offering it to them are the very ones who've taken away their human rights and democracy. And that the only real struggle in the wherever you are for human rights and democracy is the struggle for socialism, and all the others are just our lies.
If I could interrupt you for one moment, the International Marxist Humanists, let's look at their articles. Okay, so they've got this one, stand against genocide and imperialism from Palestine to Ukraine. Okay, Russia admits aims in Ukraine similar to Israel's in Gaza. From the genocide in Palestine and Ukraine. Now it's Palestine and Ukraine to the fascist threat, working towards a revolutionary Marxist humanist organization response. And we go down here. Book review, Ukraine, Voices of Resistance. Review of Ukraine Resists. And then women in the global South from U.S. imperialism, and versus imperialism from Latin America to Ukraine and from Africa to India and Iran, right? Stop Russia's imperialist war on Ukraine, solidarity with the Ukrainian people's movement. When you look at their articles,
go back down to that bottom one, Garland. What were those characters next to it? It was like something in Chinese or something.
This right here,
a Chinese translation
of the International Marxist-Humanist Organization statement on Ukraine.
So they've translated that into Chinese. That's interesting, isn't it?
Yep. Just one more page.
On the, oh my God.
The war against Ukraine and the struggle to be human. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and our response. A left response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So here's the bottom line. It's clearly nothing but a CIA operation, MI6 operation. The whole thing is a CIA MI6 operation from beginning to end, which means that those names that I mentioned earlier, the John Pfeffers and the other people, they're just all. And if you look at the positions that they take, it's always on the side of imperialism, but they always pretend to be on the left somewhere. This is a massive disinformation propaganda campaign on behalf of Ukraine. And when you look at it, you see they had all this pro-Ukraine stuff, right? If you're a socialist, if you're a lefty, you've got to support Ukraine's people's struggle, right? But at some point, they recognized the people around us are not going to buy into Gaza. So they just said, we'll take a hit on this. Yeah, Gaza's bad. Oh, that's terrible. In fact, we got to support the people's struggle in Gaza and Ukraine. And this is real slick.
Yeah, they're using the fact that the support for Palestine is very popular to shoehorn, into their talking points, basically. So it's like I said earlier, it's bandwagon jumping. In order to give yourself some credibility, to look like you're on the same side. And if you look at all of that, all those articles are, fancy ways of dressing up imperialist lies, aren't they? But they bring in themes and language of real anti-imperialism. So they talk about the oppressed women in the global South. I don't like that term, but the oppressed world. They talk about national liberation. They talk about anti-imperialism. It looks as if it's if they talk about revolution. They're using the language of socialism, the language of anti-imperialism to make themselves look like they're what an anti-imperialist and someone who's interested in socialism wants to find. But in fact, as you say, it's the exact opposite. They are dressing up imperialist lies for the better to fool the people with. We have similar figures here. These people who are so directly on the payroll. There was a guy. I don't know if he still works. I'm not really up to date with these things. I don't know if he still works for Channel 4, but kind of well-known and kind of left-wing, supposedly broadcaster interviewer called Paul Mason. And the Grey Zone outed him as being basically MI5. And he had created a chart for his handlers of people who were dangerous in the left, organizations and people, and the Grey Zone was on it. And they got hold of that. But, I think it was in relation to China in particular, but they outed him. And he was really peeved about that. But he was one of the people who stood at the front of demonstrations. Apologies if I got this wrong. I'm sure it was him who stood at the front of demonstrations 2 years ago when the special military operation was in its early days. And there was one or two tiny little pro-Ukraine demonstrations that went on the streets of London and were filmed and lots of publicity made about them, to make it look like it was a big movement. And the slogan they were chanting was arm, arm, arm Ukraine. So they were calling for more imperialist intervention in the name of progressive working class politics.
Wow. Let me ask you this before we go, if you got a couple minutes, because I think it is important. what's happening with the protest movement that's starting in the US? And that is, you've got these students out, right? And these are oftentimes they started in the elite universities where these kids are sent to be programmed, right? Deprogrammed and then reprogrammed, right? And these kids get here and they're like, hey, I don't like the idea of this. This is genocide and I'm going to go out and protest, right? And you're like, okay, what are they going to do with the kids? They're sending thugs in to beat them. We look at there's pictures from one campus where they've got snipers on the roof, clearly an intimidation tactic, most likely. But we see brutality. We see they're now saying we need a law in the United States that says we have an anti-Semitism monitor for colleges. And you can, and colleges have to comply with whatever they say, or they lose all federal funding, right? We see politicians coming out basically calling for the bashing of heads. We literally saying you should throw them off of bridges, things of that nature. Interesting. I'm very happy to see the kids in the street. And I've said this, we could never teach them what the imperialists will teach. Imperialists will teach them with a billy club upside their pumpkin heads, right? Your thoughts on that? I see that as a positive thing. Your thoughts on the whole student protest thing and the fact that it's spreading?
Well, on the one hand, it's a classic example of why the imperialists want to close down TikTok, why they're feeling so jittery about the whole situation in the Middle East. It's because they lost control of the narrative. It's spread beyond the boundaries of the algorithms that they can look down on, and because of that, they have been given the lie to every single time they've made an announcement. So when the Western media write articles giving the Israeli version of events, when the Western politicians stand up and say we must stand with Israel because they're under attack, and at this simultaneously, people are receiving onto their phones, in real time, images that directly contradict what they're being told. That dissonance is now kind of exploding, I think, in the streets and the minds of the people. The reality of the brutality of the Israeli regime and the Zionist philosophy is becoming something that people feel they have to look into now, in a way they weren't interested before. And many people who tended to read what the BBC said about the intractable nature of the latest outbreak between Israel and Palestine and go, oh dear, well, it looks like these people just can't help fighting each other. And oh, it seems very difficult to solve and resolve. But they never understood the history of the background because they were never given it. And they didn't make efforts to go and look into it for themselves. With the genocide now, and with this cognitive dissonance that's happening between what the politicians and media are saying and what the images you're seeing, so many people have been motivated and mobilized to look for themselves and look deeper. And they're like, oh, for the first time in my life, I realize what Israel is. For the first time in my life, I realize what Zionism is. For the first time in my life, I realize what's at the core of the Palestinian struggle. For the first time in my life, I realize that the USA is behind Israel in the way that it behaves. So all of these, it's not like the honest peace broker that it was presented to us in the media for the last 30, 40 years, right? So all of these things are acting on people. And we said earlier, right? Students, their capacity for that, to rage against injustice and to not want to be a part of that, even if they come from, there's many honorable instances of young people from privileged backgrounds, throwing away their privilege and siding with the oppressed when they're fired by a just cause, and you see in that a living example of why the ruling class fears and tries to control students. This whole conversation, we've been talking about Trotskyism as one of those tools of control. Another one that we talked about at other times is identity politics, right? These ways of trying to divide students, to control them mentally, the way that they think and respond and understand the injustices in the world, so that they are essentially impotent to use their energy for good. And they end up, just running around in circles until they get bored or cynical and fall off the hamster wheel. But the tactics are failing. Trotskyism is failing. Identity politics is failing. And as we said last week, I think it was, we were saying this, the overuse of the anti-Semitism slur against literally any statement of the mildest support for Palestine or against genocide in Gaza, to label absolutely everything like that as anti-Semitic is exploding the use of anti-Semitism, the term anti-Semitism, as a control mechanism. It is instead exposing the people who use that tool. Now, instead of herding the masses to go, oh my God, these people are anti-Semites, they are galvanizing the masses to look back at the people hurling the accusation of anti-Semitism and say, these people are tools of the US empire. Why are they calling us antis? I'm not an anti. I've never been a racist. Why am I being accused of racism? Because I don't like genocide. You know, the more people you do that to, and the more people they're related to, and have the more people who sympathize with them, and the more people who identify with what they're saying, the more ridiculous the charge becomes, right? And then suddenly we're like, who are the racists here actually? And why are they using the charge of racism to try to shut us up? Right, which is what they're doing. The whole point of the anti-Semitism slur is you go, oh my God, racism, shut up. You know, that's the way that these things have been used, and they're not working. And as you said, this student movement, these kids are courageous. It's wonderful to see, actually, you know, that they're finally feeling like the frustration of living in a country where you know your government is directly complicit in these horrific crimes that are taking place on a daily basis and have been going on non-stop for more than 6 months now. And the horror of feeling your inability to impact that in any way, whilst living in the belly of the beast, in the heart of the empire, and suddenly feeling like something has to be done. We have to show in some way that we are not with the government, we are not with our ruling class in their backing for this horrific crime. And, you know, the example they're setting is wonderful, because, of course, it is what the trade unions should have been doing all along. I've talked to you about this before, right? The power to stop these crimes is in our hands as working people, because the imperialists are not the ones who make the munitions, who move them, who fight the wars, who drop the bombs. They're not even the ones who broadcast the lies with which they confuse us, right? Workers press all the buttons to get on the lie machine. Workers put the newspapers out on the shelves in the supermarkets. Workers are the ones who make the munitions and then move them to where they have to be, and all the other tasks, right? So if we really wanted to stop our government's complicity in these crimes, we should be organizing the working class en masse to refuse to cooperate in any way. That job should have been initiated a long time ago by the unions, but certainly in October. It hasn't been. It should have been done 20 years ago in relation to Iraq. It should have been done in relation to Afghanistan, right? But in relation to Palestine and the latest intensification of the genocide, certainly should have been done in October. Hasn't been done. The trade unions are sitting on their hands. In fact, we have left-wing leaders, supposedly left-wing leaders of trade unions in Britain, saying, we will not succumb to the hate speech of people who are pushing us to try to take this, that, and the other position. We will support all our members. What they're basically saying is some of our members, trade union members, have jobs in the arms industry. So we couldn't possibly ask them not to cooperate with making those weapons. It's their job. We have to support them because we're a trade union and we just look after our members' interests. I mean, you know, the idea that as a class we have interests, or as human beings we have a duty to other human beings. I mean, the fact is, under international law, every one of us, individually as well as nationally, has a duty under the Genocide Convention to do what we can to prevent the perpetration of a genocide. So leave aside all the other politics and all the other things about socialism and class solidarity and everything else. Just under that, there's a duty for the working class to organize itself and say, our government is acting illegally under international law and we will not allow it to continue. But the trade unions don't want working class people to know that they have that power, that they don't want those demands to be talked about on any level. So they hide behind saying, oh, well, we're just here to protect our members' interests and nobody's asking for this. And, well, what can we do anyway? You know, blah, blah, blah. Oh, well, if we try to do that, it's against the law and we'll have our funds sequestered and, you know, we have to stay within the law and all this type of rubbish. You know, they've got a million excuses. Fundamentally, what we see is that the leadership of our trade unions, and this comes back to the conversation we were having last week about social democracy and the bribed upper stratum of the working class, they are bought off. The trade unions have become, like the Labour Party, in fact, a part of the state machinery in Britain for the control of the working class. And if the workers want to start to organise independently in their own interests, to fight their own corner, whether it's to prevent our rulers' complicity in genocide in Gaza, or whether it's to demand that we should stop paying the price for their economic crisis, right? 1/3 of British children go to school hungry and are coming home to cold houses, right? This is ridiculous. It's horrific. It's obscene. The trade unions are doing nothing. They put out, you know, kind of nice statements every now and again about how it's not very nice. They launched a campaign a couple of years ago called Enough is Enough, which had a nice pink logo and a postcard, and they got a few tub-thumping meetings going, and then nothing. As if they would, like, if they really wanted to mobilize the working class behind some real demands to save working people from plummeting into dire poverty and homelessness, they would be knocking at an open door. The truth is they don't want to mobilize the working class. They want to control the working class's anger until it fizzles out and people are left with the idea that there's not really anything much they can do. And, you know, this is the role of these people, unfortunately, and workers really need to kind of wake up to that.
You know, I won't, I know you got to go. I'll just say this. You know, I'm a very strong union person. My dad was a longshoreman, union and everything, but I found something out of some years ago studying unions during World War II on the docks in New York. There was a ship was burned and that was being prepared for use in the war. And there was a suspicion that there was German spies. So naval intelligence, government intelligence went and said, we want to, you know, can we get in good with the dock workers? And everybody told them, well, the guy who really has the in is Lucky Luciano, the gangster, and he's in jail. So they went and got him out of jail. And they said, we want you back on the docks. The gangster, right? Mafia. We want the intelligence agencies got this mafia guy out, put him in back to power and said, now here's what we're going to do. We'll give you a list of suspected German spies. And of course, you know what the mafia does to suspected, right? And then it started coming out that maybe some of those names weren't necessarily German spies. They were suspected socialists, communists, or whatever the case may be. So again, the intelligence agencies used organized crime, but I repeat myself, and they utilized them under the guise of going after German spies to go after people who were pushing back against the machine. So even a person who's very pro-union, pro-organized labor, I also see that the machine knows how to go into organized labor at the highest levels and utilize their evil tactics there for the very worst of deeds. I know you got to go. If I could get your comment on that last thing.
The imperialists, and starting in Britain, where both imperialism and trade unionism began, right? So they have huge experience. They are past masters at manipulating and buying off working class organization. And we have to recognize that if we want to be successful in the future, we've got to be realistic about this. You know, my party is regularly accused of being some ultra-left loony sect because we try to point this truth out. And, you know, the way the rest of the fake left responds to us is this kind of shock, fake outrage, like, you know, trade unions the way they present trade unions is a trade union is the highest organization of the working class and you must kiss its backside no matter what it does. Now we have a different view. Our view is, no, a trade union is an essential organizing tool of working people. The highest organization you can have in the working class is a working class political party. It's the Communist Party, because it's ideologically trained as well as organized. And it's trained and ideologically motivated not merely to fight for its rights under this system of wage slavery, but to push through that barrier and take us into socialism. So it's the most trained, disciplined, ideologically motivated section of the organized working classes in the party. But nevertheless, we recognize the great importance of trade union organization for building mass organization amongst the working people. But we can't be blind to what's been done to our trade unions. They no longer fight for anything that they were set up for. They don't like to go on strike. They don't save strike. For the whole point of a trade union was that everyone paid their dues so that when they needed to struggle against employers by going on strike, they could get strike pay to enable them to stand the difficulties of not getting paid while they withdrew their labor. Because that's the horrible catch-22 for workers, isn't it? They're supposed to be grateful to have a job, and when the conditions are too terrible and the pay is too terrible, the only thing they can do is refuse to work, and then they're even poorer for a while, right? The hope is that they're going to win the battle, get better paying conditions, and get back to work in conditions that are somewhat more livable, right? But that's very difficult to do, and you can only manage it if you organize collectively and pay your union dues, and then the union supports you, so gives you good leadership, helps you stick together. You all share your funds so that you can stay alive through that difficult period of the strike, right? That's the point of a union. What union in Britain is doing that now? I mean, they don't do it. Right? They refuse. We have mega unions in Britain with millions of members in them. They have never once, these mega unions, called a strike of all their members. In fact, the bigger our unions get, the smaller the strikes become, because the law and the way the unions reflect the law is that whenever there's a dispute, they narrow it down to the smallest number of people concerned possible and say, oh, this dispute only concerns this little group over here. And the whole rest of the union, is not concerned with it. Most of the union members are not even informed about the fact that some of their supposedly co-members are having a dispute somewhere, and maybe they'd like to support it in some way. And if they are informed, the idea of support is like, send an email saying, well done, guys. The idea that we use our material strength, our strength of our numbers, can you imagine if these mega unions actually did that? Then that would be organization, right? They would say, right, we've got 1 million members, we're pulling them all out until you sort out the nurses. Never happening. And they are totally subservient to the ruling class. Now, we try to remind people that there are honorable moments in our class history that should serve us as a template, as a blueprint for what we should be doing now. If you have to, it's a bit tragic, but if you go all the way back to 1920, I don't know if you've heard of the incident of the Jolly George. Probably not, because you grew up in America and you have all your own stories about the heroic battles of the working class. In 1920, Britain was getting ready to send munitions and soldiers to the new Soviet Republic of Russia, along with all the other countries that were getting together to invade and try to crush the new Bolshevik Republic. A mass campaign was organized, a grassroots campaign amongst the British working class. It was called Hands Off Russia. And it became so big that even leaders of reactionary unions and reactionary TUC leadership and the Trade Union Congress leadership, even all the way back to 1920, was pretty loyal to imperialism and didn't really like rocking the boat. But the pressure from below was so great that they had to threaten the ruling class with a general strike if it persisted. And the ruling class knew that the threat had teeth. They knew that the most militant unions were fully on board with this, and the most militant unions those days had real power in the state. They were the dockers, the railway workers, and the miners, and they had real power economically in the country, and they were very, very militant. During that period, there was a refusal by dockers to load a ship called the Jolly George in the Thames, I think it was, in London, with munitions and soldiers that were supposed to go to Russia. They refused to load it. There was this threat of a general strike, and the British government actually had to pull out of the war effort.
Wow.
And not only that, it granted some concessions in terms of better pensions and unemployment benefit to the working class in Britain. Why? It wanted to pacify them quickly because it was terrified. Because the mass movement of organized workers made its power felt, and they went, shit, we're in trouble if we don't do something. So not only did they pull out of the intervention against Russia, but they granted concessions to working people to try to bring down the temperature of class warfare in Britain. And, you know, that was essentially successful. But yeah, it's a very important lesson for us in our history that the real way to get your point across, to get your platform implemented, and to get the things you need from the working class is to organize, and organize to win, organize like you mean it.
I'll end by saying this. You know, I had an instance where when I used to work with a particular congressman's office on Capitol Hill some years ago, when I didn't know what I know now about imperialism, and one of the things I did was I went out and I met with a person who was the representative on Capitol Hill of a national union, trade union. This guy was their person. He was basically their liaison to Congress, right? Couple of things. When I went to the place where this guy's office was, man, the money was flowing. This trade union had rented this, I'm not going to say, just a place on Capitol Hill. That was a luxurious home, almost close to a mansion. And I thought, wow, hey, man, this trade union's got real money, right? So this person's job was, they were the liaison to Congress, right? I met with the person. And over the course, I was talking about like anti-war stuff. And somewhere in the conversation, the guy stopped me and said, you know, basically pointed out a contradiction that they have. He was honest about it. He says, look, I know you're opposing this or that and blah, 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 and the budget and all that, but we can't oppose the military budget because, and the member of Congress was opposing the military budget. He wasn't voting for it. Good guy. Congressman John Conyers, the guy that led the out of Iraq caucus, the out of Afghanistan caucus, you name it, right? Okay. Who got Me Too'd out of Congress. What do you know? But the thing I remember that guy saying to me is, well, you know, we have guys working in the defense industry. We have a lot of our, you know, union members are working in the defensive industry, and they're making good money, man. They're making, he started saying, they're making this amount. He was telling me the amount they're making. They got great benefits. They got this and that. So we can't really. So what the guy's saying is, we're a trade union. We cannot oppose imperialism because our people are complicit in imperialism.
You know, there's two questions that come to me when I listen to that story. And one is, as workers, can't we demand other useful jobs to do? Is there such a shortage of things that people need that the only jobs that can pay well are ones making weapons? Like, what? Why do we just accept that, right? And the other one is, I do remember that there are honourable exceptions to self-interest, if you like, in the USA as well. I remember during the Iraq War that there were dockers, I think on the West Coast, who went on strike in protest about what was happening in Iraq. And this was, you know, this was not a purely self-interested, you know, motivation. This was a solidarity action by workers, you know, in the interests of humanity, right? And fundamentally, we have to recognize that until we let go of believing that the only way we can get on is by serving, you know, the rich and powerful, you know, we're not going to win through to a really decent life.
You're right. Joti Brar, thank you very much. Everybody go to thecommunists.org with an S if you want more information. They've got Proletarian TV on YouTube. Proletariat TV, right? Or is it Proletarian? I had it right the first time. Proletarian TV to find out more. Joti, where can they follow you on various social media platforms that you haven't been thrown off yet?
So
like
I am sort of on Twitter. I'm not that bothered about it personally. I am on Telegram just with my name, Joti Brar, and my party is on Telegram, The Communists. You can also follow the World Anti-Imperialist Platform on Telegram if you go to Platform News.
Great. You know, I'm going to start looking a bit more into the Ukraine Solidarity Network. Isn't it just, I knew when you know what, I'll say this. Whenever I see like some organization for democracy and I start snooping around who they're, and you'll say, this is who we're connected to. This is our network. And it's like all the same people. And oftentimes when you look at like the graphics, you can see it was all done with the same,
but the same designer.
You know, the website, everything. I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm going to start on some of that. I'm going to search the who is. You know, so you can find out who owns it. It'll probably come back to some guy named Charles Ignatius Angleton in Langley, Virginia. So, okay. Well, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Proletarian TV on YouTube. Share this on all your social media platforms with all your friends, and have a great day. We're out.